After two lectures on Ludwig Wittgenstein, I'm going to move on a bit because I'm going to present the ideas of so-called Oxfordian school. This school of thought dealt mainly with ordinary language. This is the reason why it's called ordinary language philosophy. The biggest idea of this movement were speech acts, originally invented by J.L. Austin. I want you to understand that these philosophers were heavily influenced by Ludwig Wittgenstein in his second phase, in the phase of philosophical investigations, mainly by his invention of pragmatics. The main part of my lecture will be about John Langshaw Austin, an Oxfordian philosopher and linguist who died prematurely in 1960. He was diagnosed with cancer few months before his death. He was a leading proponent of ordinary language philosophy, and this philosophical movement flourished between, well, let's say the year 1940 and 1965, mainly in Oxford. I want to explain that both schools of early analytic philosophy ended unsuccessfully. I'm talking, of course, about logical empiricism and about this ordinary language philosophy. You should understand that Cambridge and Vienna philosophers were not able to construct an ideal language they dreamt about. This is the reason why I'll call this movement unsuccessful. But also, Oxford philosophy was unsuccessful in its own merit, because we can say that it dissolved in linguistics when analyzing ordinary languages. They didn't deal with real philosophical problems. They were interested mainly in linguistical aspects of using ordinary language. Well, let's start with Austin's philosophy. The important thing is that Austin didn't publish anything during his lifetime. He was quite unsuccessful as an academic. His two series of lectures were both published by his students after his death, and these two books are called How to Do Things with Words and Sense and Sensibilia. The name of the first one is quite important because it's exactly what Austin wanted to do with philosophy of language. He was interested in how to do things with words. We'll see that later on. And if you think that sense and sensibilia sounds a bit familiar, well, you're completely right, because this book was named after Jane Austen and her very famous novel Sense and Sensibility. John L. Austen was quite a big fan of Jane Austen, and he admired her style of writing. According to Austen, the main problem of ideal language philosophy is oversimplification. Austen felt that Vienna Circle and Cambridge philosophers, I mean philosophers like Bertrand Russell and Rudolf Carnap, they oversimplified the problems of philosophy. According to Austen, natural languages are too complex to be reduced to just a few rules. According to Austen, philosophers and linguists like to come up with well-arranged categories and round numbers. This is the reason why they usually talk about 2, 3, or 4 kinds of something, or why they invent 10 or 12 categories of anything. Well, this idea of oversimplification of philosophy of language and theory of communication was probably the main reason why Austen started to be invested in pragmatics. I would say that the main achievement of Oxford School was the appreciation of pragmatics. I hope you understand that pragmatics were not invented by these Oxfordian philosophers. It has a bit deeper roots and a bit longer history because it probably started in Wittgenstein too. But these philosophers, they really appreciated pragmatics as the central topic for linguistics. According to Austen, syntax and semantics are not enough for understanding language, because according to him, meaning depends on a context, and quite often also on non-linguistic reality. You have to understand something about the environment of communication to understand what's going on in that particular communication. Austen pointed out that Wittgenstein's picture theory of language that was based on the verification principle is incomplete. Well, by picture theory of language, I understand every theory that considers that facts are references for sentences, and the verification principle means that we understand sentences because we can understand their truth conditions. This is the verification principle. Well, Wittgenstein showed us that there are many instances of sentences without truth value, for example, questions and wishes and imperatives and stuff like that. But according to Austen, there are also many declarative statements without any truth value. To quote Austen himself, sentences are not as such either true or false, which means, according to Austen, that there are a lot of declarative statements that do not have any truth value. This is the reason why we cannot understand them based on their truth conditions. The example of declarative statements without any truth value are performative utterances, or as Austen called them, performatives. According to Austen, there are two kinds of utterances or two kinds of statements, constatives and performatives. Constatives are our usual declarative statements with truth value. They are usually used to describe something. They are usually about facts. Performatives are quite different because they do not describe anything. They do something. And this is the reason why Austen was interested in how to do things with words. He believed that performatives can do something real in the real world. We have many examples of performative utterances, and I will give you some from Austen's writings. Let's have the sentence, I do. This is said by a man during the course of the marriage ceremony. You understand that this utterance does not describe anything. It does something. When you pronounce it and you really mean it, you really take that woman who is standing by your side to be your lawful wedded wife. Without saying these words, nothing would happen in the real world. You have to say them to perform something. And this is the reason why this is a classical example of performative utterance. Another example is, I name this ship the Queen Elizabeth, as uttered when smashing the bottle against the stem of the ship. When you pronounce these words, you really do something. You name that ship with this particular name. I give and bequeath my watch to my brother, as occurring in a will. I hope you understand. Or the last example is, I bet you 6 pence it will rain tomorrow. Another classical example of sentence without any truth value that performs something because you do things with uttering this statement. The division between constitutives and performatives is a part of a much more general theory, the theory of speech acts. This approach was invented by John L. Austin and his student John Searle. I'm going to talk about Searle a bit more later on in my lectures. Now you should know that he was an American, but he spent some months of his studies in Oxford under supervision of Austin. Now he teaches at University of California in Berkeley. According to Austin, speech act is every situation when language is used. As you can see, this definition of speech act is again very vague, in the same vein as, for example, Wittgenstein's definition of language games. The reason for it is again the same. Speech acts are very general facts. They exist around us. We deal with them every day. You cannot talk without dealing with speech acts. According to Austin, speech act has 3 levels of explication, and he called these 3 levels locutionary act, illocutionary act, and perlocutionary act. Well, you could have seen that Austin was strongly against oversimplification, and he didn't agree with dividing something into 2 or 3 parts. But now you can see that he did this oversimplification too, because he talked about 2 kinds of utterances, constitutives and performatives. And he thought that speech acts have 3 levels of explication, as you can see here. Well, that's something that cannot be avoided probably. Locutionary act is the actual utterance based on grammatical rules. It means that it's based on rules of phonetics, syntax, and semantics. You can imagine a sentence enclosed in quotation marks. Well, this is locutionary act. Illocutionary act is something else. It is the meaning intended by a speaker. It is something that speaker has on his or her mind when uttering a sentence. Well, and perlocutionary act is the effect on an addressee. And you can see that the effect might be completely different from the meaning intended. You can use the same sentence with a good meaning, but it might be harshly misunderstood. For example, imagine the cases of irony. When I say a sentence, for example, "You look beautiful today," it might be misunderstood in perlocutionary act, and an addressee might consider it an insult. Austin, in his last years, tried to make a list of all English verbs with illocutionary force, and he identified more than 1,000 of them. He wrote this very long list of all these verbs. For example, asking, answering, assuring, warning, sentencing, acquitting, diagnosing, excommunicating, resigning, promising, betting, apologizing, toasting, postulating, defining, and so on and so on. He found out more than 1,000 of verbs like these. You can clearly see that this has almost nothing to do with philosophy, not even with philosophy of language. This is just pure linguistics. And this is the reason why Austin's and Searle's theory of speech acts is much more popular at departments of philology than on departments of philosophy. Austin's and Searle's theory of speech acts has a lot of practical uses. I'm going to show you just one of them that was invented by Paul Grice, a British philosopher of language who taught at Oxford and Berkeley. Grice, and I don't want to talk about that a lot, is an author of intention-based semantics. This is sometimes called Gricean semantics. He's the main proponent and inventor of this approach. By intention-based semantics, we mean semantics that are based on intentions. I'm sorry for this vague definition again. To be more clear, this is semantics that deals with psychological states of our minds. According to Grice, we have to understand what's going on in our minds to understand the linguistic meaning. But, sorry, I'm not going to talk about that. It's quite abstract. Grice wrote a lot of papers during his lifetime, but he didn't publish a book. His only book was called Studies in the Way of Words, and it was published posthumously again in 1989. I would say that his most famous and most important short papers were Meaning from 1957 and Logic and Conversation from 1975. It was this essay Meaning that was the basis for intention-based semantics. And in Logic and Conversation, Grice described his theory of implied meaning and implicatures. I'm going to talk about implied meaning and implicatures in my next slide. But to understand what these are, firstly, I have to talk about cooperative principle. According to Grice and many others, people who engage in communication have to cooperate because speakers are bound to be understood and listeners are bound to understand. This is exactly the case right now. I want to make my ideas clear using as simple language as I can, and you are trying to give my sentences a meaning by means of, I don't know, understanding the language. That's it. In his Logic and Conversation, Grice wrote, "Make your conversational contribution such as is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you are engaged." I would say that this is the basis of cooperative principle. I'm not going to talk about that too much because I want you to read a short sample from this paper, and I want to discuss it, if you want to, on our online meeting. Well, in his essay Logic and Conversation, Grice wrote about 4 maxims that every communication have to accept. These maxims are called maxims of quantity, quality, utilization, and manner. And again, I'm not going to define them or explain them. Please read the text. Everything's there. According to Grice, there are 2 types of speech, saying and implying. When you are saying something, you are trying to express something directly. When implying, you just suggest something indirectly. And this is the reason why we can have 2 types of meaning according to Grice. The first one is explicit, which means fully expressed. And the other one might be called implicit because it is just partially suggested. Examples of these 2 meanings you can find again in Logic and Conversation. The most important term of Grice's theory of communication is an implicature. And there are 2 kinds of implicatures, conventional and conversational. Conventional implicatures are based on a general knowledge of the larger community. It means that everyone who has some general background in culture of a community can understand a conventional implicature. A typical example of these implicatures are proverbs. Anyone can understand them in any context if he or she is acquainted with culture. The other example, or the other type of implicatures, are conversational implicatures. These are based on the circumstances of the specific conversation. By that I mean that only people who are involved in the specific conversation can understand what's going on in conversational implicatures. Again, there are a lot of examples in that text by Paul Grice I want you to read. This is your required reading. I have few questions for you to answer based on the text, logic and conversation. And these questions are, the first one, what are the maxims of communication? I understand that I just have spoken about them, but I want you to explain what do these maxims mean. The second, what are implicatures? The third one, explain the difference between conventional and conversational implicatures. Again, I just have, but please try to devise your own new original examples. And the last question I want to discuss is try to find a way how implicatures can be used in expressing stereotypes. And in my last two slides, I'm going to help you a bit with this task. I think that implicatures, conversational or conventional, might be quite dangerous because they are sometimes used, very oftenly, to express stereotypes. Let's think about this sentence for a while. Why should you study mathematics? You are a girl. I would say that there is nothing wrong at the first sight with this sentence. You have to think about it a bit longer and maybe deeper to understand that it is based on an implied meaning. There is an implicature somewhere in there, and this implicature is that girls are not good at mathematics. Maybe there's a stronger implicature that girls are not as intelligent as their male counterparts. And I think that this might be dangerous to think something like that. Another example is the sentence, his name is Shaquille, but he has not been to prison yet. Again, this sentence might seem quite innocent until you give it a thought. The point is that Shaquille is a typical name for Black Americans, for African Americans. And there is implied meaning that these black persons are criminals more often than white persons, and this is the reason why they are going to be sent to prison more probably than white ones. And the last example is about immigrants. They came to Europe in a boat. They must be terrorists. By the way, there are many implications here. There are many conventional implicatures here. Because when someone comes to Europe in a boat, we have this intuitive feeling that he or she must be an immigrant. And when someone is an immigrant, he or she probably comes from Muslim countries. And there's also a implied meaning that when someone comes from a Muslim country, he must be Muslim, which means that he has this strong tendency to be a terrorist too. I don't want to talk about face value of this sentence or about face values of these sentences. I just want to show you that we have to understand implied meaning, that we have to understand conventional implicatures to understand what really is going on in sentences like these. We can use implicatures also for another reason, and it's sophisticated lying. The master of this sophisticated line was Bill Clinton. I'm not sure if you know who he was. He was a president during the 90s of the United States. For example, Bill Clinton uttered this sentence: "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky." You can see them both on the cover of Time magazine here. But unfortunately for Clinton, when the news about his sexual relation to Miss Lewinsky came up, he tried to argue that he implied something else. The implicature here is that oral sex is not a sexual relation, which meant, according to Clinton, that even when he had oral sex with Miss Lewinsky, it was not a basis for a sexual relation. And another example of using conversational implicatures in a sophisticated line is again by Mr. Clinton. He said, "I have never used marijuana." When pictures of him smoking marijuana were published, he again tried to defend himself, saying, "Well, I implied something else here. Using is inhaling. I was not inhaling marijuana, I was just smoking it. I was just puffing it. I didn't get the smoke into my lungs." And this is the reason, according to Bill Clinton, why he could have said that he had never used marijuana. Well, I don't believe in these two examples. I do not believe in these two interpretations. But my point is that it is quite possible to use conventional and conversational implicatures in quite unreasonable way. So that's it for today. See you next time.